Good morning. Welcome to Conversations at our Basel, Miami Beach. I'm Ed Winkleman, and we are very honored this morning to have a panel exploring the legacy of Carolee Schneemann. We have some very distinguished points of view to help us review that, including from the far left, Wendy Olsoff, who is the co-owner of P.P.O.W. Gallery in New York, who have worked with Carolee Schneemann for 20 years. The artist Narcissister, who is in character, and the artist Judith Bernstein. And we are very fortunate to have guiding this conversation curator from New York, Dan Cameron, who curated the very first retrospective of Carolee's work at the New Museum. Please join me in giving them a very warm welcome.
Thank you so much, Ed. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our conversations this morning. My name is Dan Cameron. I'm really happy to be here with these three very distinguished panelists, co-panelists. We were just discussing backstage that this really is going to be a conversation. What we want to do is get each person to participate as much as possible. But I've already sort of become the fly in the ointment, because what I want to do is kind of talk a little bit in a semi-formal way about my own relationship and feelings to Carolee Schneemann's work. Because a lot of times I find myself stopping and thinking about where we are right now in the art world and asking myself, what got us here? Where are we? How did this history that led us to this point get formed? And like anyone else, I think about history personally. I think about it in a subjective way. And so I guess today what I want to start by doing is telling you a little bit about my story in relationship to Carolee Schneemann. I became what I would like to think of as a fanboy of the work. I was in Bennington College. It was the mid-1970s. Performance art was still very early in its sort of birthing stage. And I kind of came across the work of Carolee Schneemann by way of her collaborations with the Judson Dance Theater. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with the history, Judson Dance Theater was a very loosely organized collective of artists who had attended most of them, John Cage's performance workshops, classes at the New School in the mid-50s. And what John Cage was encouraging them to do was get out of their disciplines. So if they were dancers, they were encouraged to move towards music, towards visual art. If they were painters, assemblages, as Carolee was, they were urged to collaborate with dancers and choreographers and just move beyond their medium. And I was looking for that at that moment in my life. I feel that as a 19-year-old at the time, I was reading Avalanche, I was reading semiotext, and what Carolee was doing was the subject of very heated discussion in the art department where I was. It didn't seem like anyone who actually taught visual art at Bennington really supported Carolee's work. The painters were suspicious, the sculptors were, semi-hostile, or dismissive, I would say. The support that I found, even though I knew that Carolee came out of the visual arts, was from the dance faculty at Bennington and the theater faculty and the people who taught interdisciplinary work like video, who said, no, this artist really is a pioneer. This is someone who really, really paved the way. So it all happened with Meet Joy. Meet Joy was a 1964 performance at Judson Dance Theater, which wound up in the pages of Time magazine. She was sort of anointed the high priestess of the avant-garde, a label which would be revived from time to time. But everyone seemed to agree that at that moment, even though there were other artists working, and even though she was in a context which was defined by collective and collaborative work, within the visual arts field, within the realm of gallery art, Carolee Schneemann took a very particular sort of journey that pushed her out of all limits in terms of materials, in terms of discipline. And really open up what art making could be for at that time and as the future. So I didn't really know until I started working on the exhibition at the New Museum just how formidable the opposition to Carolee Schneemann's work is in the art world. This turned out to be the title work for the retrospective I put together, which was called Up to and Including Her Limits. And the work actually takes multiple forms, which was sort of a specialty of Carolee's by this point. What you see right now is the performance version, where she is using a tree pruner's harness to suspend herself slightly over the floor, so that when she wants to, when she chooses to, her body, the involuntary pulses of her body are what's guiding her movement across the floor. She can also pull herself out of the harness, as you can see at this particular moment, and draw. So she uses the gestures of her body to create a fully surrounding drawing, and then eventually she leaves, and the drawing stays with the setup, as you see it in the picture here. And then, as it was shown at the museum, a stack of videos documents the performance as it happened. I remember when we were putting together the work, somebody said, well, you know, you're not going to show interior scroll, are you? It makes the mid-90s seem a long time ago already. And I said, well, why wouldn't we show interior scroll? And the explanation was that, well, you know, it's really the most transgressive piece of all, and it's going to make people uncomfortable. And as a gay man, I guess, at that time, I really felt like, well, now, wait a minute. There's no implicit threat to any existing order that I feel particularly invested in this work. In fact, the mutability of her art itself points towards a future where maybe we still haven't consolidated that future yet, but at least we're getting a little bit closer to realizing it. So interior scroll, for those of you who don't know it, consists of a letter. The letter is written to an imaginary colleague, and it's about the possibility that women could become... Sorry? Go ahead and jump in.
It's Annette Mickelson, right? The letter?
Yeah, but okay, it's Annette Mickelson. I know there was a period where Carolee wanted to be a little bit more discreet in calling her out. Maybe not. But anyway, the letter is to a post-structuralist film theorist, basically taking on the issue of subjectivity and women's identity, women's perspective on the world. And as she's reading it, she literally pulls the scroll from inside of her and presents it in a live performance. When it was shown at the museum, and I think the more permanent version has the photo documentation and the scroll itself. I felt that here you see part of the text actually incorporated into the image itself. So when I began to start thinking seriously about the categories that Carolee's creating, all of these new ways of looking at the archetypal past, looking at the archaic, looking at the realm of mythology, and bringing all of this visual information into contemporary art making, I really began to think that the deeper I started thinking about Carolee's approach to making her work, the more other philosophical frameworks that had been dominant up until that time just really seemed to fade much more into the background. And I began to question the museum institutional structure and the need to open up our ideas about paradigms in art history. Just to imagine what Carolee was doing being incorporated into a museum environment, a museum structure, where you have minimalism, where you have, Judd and Andre and Morris, and something like Mortal Coils, which really is about remembering the people in your life who've died, who've gone on recently to the afterlife, and trying to make a work about that personal, private, intense, painful, but also spiritual experience. How does an artist do that? How do we grapple with these issues going forward into the future? So I worked with Carolee a couple of other times after doing the retrospective. We worked together on a biennial in Taipei, where her work was already very, very famous. But I would say for the last 20 years of her production, more specifically, my function in her life was as a friend who loved Carolee and supported her and would always want to be there. And so in return, what we all got, what her friends got, were updates on her life, on her health, on her struggles, to stay healthy, to stay alive. And they were always works of art. They were both the message that she wanted to convey to me as a friend, and they were also something that you just wanted to look at, and then look at some more, and then linger with, and internalize moving forward. So I guess for me, I wrote my first article for an art magazine in 1983 for Arts Magazine on Carolee's assemblages, because at that time I thought, oh, everybody already knows her performance. She's so famous. People don't really know the assemblage work yet. So as I've been thinking about Carolee and sort of missing Carolee and feeling like Carolee is still part of what I'm doing and what we're all trying to do and come together, I guess the image that summed it all up for me was her Christmas card from 2013, which is stay dry, stay warm, and have a very happy new year. So thank you all. I was hoping we could make it a conversation from the get-go, but unfortunately I'm the kind of talker that once you let me get going, I just keep talking. But on that note, I did want to just pass the mic, although she has one already.
I have one already.
She has one already, to Judith Bernstein, who is friend and colleague, and who is here under heroic circumstances. So I personally am just thrilled that you could join us today, Judith.
Well, I'm thrilled to be here, and I'm also thrilled because of speaking about Carolee. And Carolee Schneemann was super fab. Her art merited recognition throughout her career, and she got a lot before she died, which was a great gift. She made her mark early with her definitive performance pieces of the 1960s and 70s. Her groundbreaking interior scroll detonated art history in 1975. It was first performed at the show Women Here and Now in East Hampton, New York. She asked Joan Semmel, who organized the exhibition, together with Joyce Kozlov, if she knew what type of glue would work best with vaginal fluid. Joan had no clue. Carolee's work was undeniably outspoken and rageful. She gave birth to a literal and psychological scroll. It was a voice from within. She was part of the feminist community. We hung out together at art openings and loft parties and went to bars to network and meet guys. We were included in shows together because of the extremely confrontational and sexual content of our art. Our sensibilities overlapped. Maybe you could keep going through it, yeah. At the end of the day, it was the nature of our work that truly connected us. We were both screaming to be heard. We each understood each other's message because it was coming from the same place. It was an artistic sisterhood. I know that my own work conveys meaning and emotion through a rageful visual impact. Carolee also used rage as a source, having literally harnessed her body to make a painting. Where her work is more veiled, mine is more direct. In communicating my rage against injustice and patriarchy. My work contains a complex subtext which can contain contradictory but valid interpretations. When I was a student at Yale in the 60s, I started my Fuck Vietnam series, which led to my 60s and 70s Screw series, which is sexual, anti-war, and feminist. It is a critique of the male hierarchy and machismo. I've used the phallus in the majority of my work, including a series called Dick in the Head, because the power of the penis can exist in many forms, specifically intellectual power. When I went to literally my humongous signature series where women are at the center, and later used the vagina as a central theme in Birth of the Universe, then an anti-Trump series called Money Shot and Death Universe. Both our practices came from our inner core, hers birthing from the vagina, and mine a metaphor using the penis. The penis represents power. Every woman has a penis. Not literally, but figuratively. Men literally have a penis, but they do not have the copyright on it. Women have a metaphorical penis. It is a source of women's power. Carolee used the vagina as a source of power, where her creativity lies. With her interior scroll, it was more than birthing a child. It was birthing ideas. These are some of these of mine that coincides with some of the things I've been saying. A giant signature piece, Women at the Center, stardom and stuff. This was a new museum show that had my signature on the outside, and inside you get to. It was a mini pocket retrospective, Birth of the Universe. And it makes a metaphor for the universe and birth of all life, and etc. This was Black Light, one that was done in the Box LA. This was at Studio Voltaire in London, and you see the penises marching. And this is a repurposed church. At Studio Voltaire, and the vagina right in the center. It's in a certain way, it's kind of a takeoff on a Mary and Mary Magdalene, Mary in the center, as well as a gold icon. Dick in the head, by the way, that's the center of source of power. Donald Trump, all-American spread eagle. A man I detest. And this is my own, one of my last pieces that is called Death Universe, and it's about the end of the universe in terms of Donald Trump, and also not only that, colliding asteroids, and anyway, colliding I'm trying to think of some of the other things, by the way, and also the way Donald Trump has baited Kim Jong-un, etc. It's not really only about Donald Trump. It goes into a much larger umbrella of information. Thanks.
I'm so honored to be here truly with my fellow panelists, and to honor Carolee Schneemann's work. Of course, I had known of the interior scroll performance. I had that image on the wall of my studio for quite some time, way before I started the Narcissister project in around 2007. So that gesture was part of my subconsciousness, and when I knew that I wanted to start a performance project, I came from a dance background, and I was also making visual art. And again, when I knew I wanted to start working in the medium of performance, I was thinking very much of radical gestures such as hers. And there were other women artists and men too who had used their bodies in the art context in very radical ways. So One example was the Japanese woman, I believe the last name is Kubota, who did the vaginal paintings with the paintbrush in her vagina. I was thinking about Annie Sprinkle's work, who also used her orifices, the inside of her vagina in her work. I was thinking about Vienna Actionists, and I was thinking about Matthew Barney's work. So there was something about using the interior surfaces of the body, not just the vagina, that I knew that I wanted to incorporate in my own performance project, and to make the project strong and confrontational and radical in that way. So there's some images, I guess I'm responsible for scrolling through them. So again, yes, I do this gesture of extracting things from my bodily orifices in my performance work. Most commonly my vagina, and sometimes I say to Wanda, my choreographer, dramaturg, I feel like I'm a broken record because here I am pulling something out of my vagina again. There's just something that's so essential and foundationally and fundamentally radical about that gesture. So here's a cell phone in my piece that's called Basket. And I've also included some of my collage work. I'm inspired by Carolee's practice also, in that it covered so many different media. So she made films, and I'm making films. She incorporated dance in her work, as I do as well. And these more recent collage images of mine, where I'm fracturing the female face, are very much inspired by the image of hers. I don't know the name of that work, but where her face is fractured in a eye body. That's another image I've known of and has had a big impact on me. And so this fracturing of the woman's face, I've incorporated into my recent collage practice. Again, this gesture of extracting things from the vagina, and I find myself taking, there's not always, but there's often in the works, there's a certain pose that's sort of necessary in order to bear down, if one is standing, to bear down and extract something, and it is ends up being very much a mirror of this pose that Carolee took during interior scroll. Again, using all orifices of my body, extracting things from my mouth and also from my anus at times. So, great. I just want to think if there's anything else I want to say. I think that it's, again, I'm just very honored to be situated within the legacy of her work. And I know that there's a common practice in the art world of even female artists, of her work being validated by it being placed in the lineage of a male artist. And I just want to say that I'm especially excited, honored, and comforted that even in my being invited to participate here today, that my work is being validated and sort of included in the canon, if you will, by it being placed in the context of Carolee Schneemann's work, not in the context of a man's work. So, thank you.
Thank you. Wendy.
So, okay. So it's wonderful to speak after my colleagues and these artists. And you can see with Judith and Narcissister how Carolee's legacy is being continued. And how it deals specifically with the female body and the power of the female body. Carolee always spoke about double knowledge, and I think as women, particularly, and I can obviously speak to that, double knowledge, she said, is what you think is true and could be life experience, and what the culture tells you is not possible. And even with all of Carolee's work, it's really important that we continue recognizing double knowledge exists now very strongly, and we have much to fight for still. So I began with this slide, which is called Ask the Goddess, because I think, as Narcissister mentioned, it's important and not to think of Carolee as like the person who changed art history, because many, many, many women came before and during her lifetime, but with the denigration of female power and sexuality. The power of female sexuality, I think we just spoke about that. History's been denied a truth, and Carolee always knew that from a young age. She perceived it. In her exhibitions, her childhood drawings were always there because she knew that power. And she, also at a young age, when her father told her she was just a girl and couldn't go to art school, and then she went to Bard. Anyway, I'm going to get back to this. And this was a painting she did at Bard of her partner, James Tenney, a musician. And she portrayed him, typically as women were often portrayed as an odalisque. He was sleeping, and because his genitals were exposed, because she painted that, the male teachers tried to get her kicked out of Bard. So this is 1957. So by the time she was at Judson, she had already fought many battles. And by the time she got to meet Joy, she was already denigrated and disrespected. And, her paintbrushes virtually were taken away because the male artists thought they deserved more recognition. And this still happens today, and it's why Carolee's work isn't better collected and known, really. And she's really known, and this has disturbed her, for Interior Scroll, for Meet Joy. She's really an amazing academic. I mean, her archives are in Stanford, and at Stanford University and the Getty Museum. She's written extensively about her work and about feminism. She's done pieces about the Vietnam War and about the war in the Middle East. She's done many important, significant pieces about the medical industrial complex and its denial of care to women. So she's more than Interior Scroll, and I think that's really important to remember in her legacy. And she's left a lot of evidence for future scholars to learn from. So going backwards, I don't know if I can go backwards. This is one of the eye bodies, and here Carolee did many performances where she was the subject, where she was naked in male performances in the 60s. And eventually, she made this very important assemblage. And she did not like be called a performance artist either, by the way. She's a painter, and she always wanted to be remembered as a painter, and all her work comes from that tradition. So her legacy is complex, but in this instance, I bring it up, this piece, for cutting boards. Museum of Modern Art bought this piece. It was an amazing victory for her in her lifetime. And she made this assemblage in her studio, and it's kinetic. And then she put herself in front of it, and Ero, a photographer, photographed her by her own imperatives and instructions in 33 poses. And she became the object and the object maker. She was no longer the subject. And that's really, really important as well. So I just want to end and say that I think Carolee's legacy, and if you walk through the art fair, you'll see so many women artists, and so many women artists like these two fabulous women using their bodies to express themselves, and society fears that, especially now with a very patriarchal monster in the White House. I know Carolee would have felt it was more important than ever for women to assert their power and their voice and not be fearful.
Great. Thank you so much, Wendy. Thank you, Narcissister, and thank you, Judith. I wanted to just throw out a general question to the panel, if I could, because taking in mind Griselda Pollock's idea that when you allow a full feminist critique of art history, what you end up needing to do is just kind of tossing out the whole concept of art history and trying to replace it with something that actually would work better. And I was thinking of the idea of originary, that there are places where an artist is so generative in what they do that they do maybe not rest comfortably in the same structures of art history that we've always lived with, but they can be seen to have pioneered or moved into terrain that no one else was willing to take on, at least with not the same dedication and energy that they did. And bearing in mind that we don't want to just repeat these ideas of who was first and who did things sort of alone, would you reflect on Carolee as an originary figure in recent art, as someone who really, until she came along, certain things simply were not possible or were not permitted?
Like what things were not possible or permitted?
Well, certain kinds of practices. For example, being able to be a painter and to work in performance and to create theory and to work in independent film and to be able to actually function and move forward in multiple disciplines all at the same time. This doesn't seem, I search for someone else who is that, not even competent, but that immensely gifted in all of these different areas that she took on, and I am at a loss to name anybody else who has that same level of distinction in all of those different fields.
Well, she was a unique voice. There's no question about that, and which is fabulous. And women have had unique voices, and now they are much more touted at this point in time. Now, it could also sometimes. Actually, what happens is when the market goes down, more women are touted because of the fact their work is less valued and less expensive. But other than the marketplace, which is a whole different area, I do think that she had a unique voice, and she kept going, and that was so important. And I know that in my own practice, I kept going, regardless of if I was showing or selling, whatever. I kept going because I had something to say, and something that was very important for me to say, as she did. And she was quite heroic, if I can use that masculine term. But nevertheless, she knew that she had a legacy, and she kept going for it. And I know that I have that same drive and ambition. And it's really important. Unfortunately, in all arts, you have to keep going. It's not just the past. It's the present, and it's also the future. So it's a continuum, and it's very important to be part of all that. And I know that for a long time I did not exhibit. And so what happened was that now that I'm getting more well-known and more international recognition, there's a tremendous amount to go into, because I had a lot of things from the past, which was the Fuck Vietnam series, which I had shows at the Box, which is owned by Paul McCarthy, and also a show at Mary Boone that had some works from there too. And then I had the Screw series, in a certain way turned the tables and mocked the guys too. But it also showed that women have that power, that enormous power. And then I also went to large signature pieces, and the signature that put women at the center. And it also was about stardom, fame, ego, male posturing, and my ego. I don't leave myself out either, by the way. And then from there, I did many other things, but I did Birth of the Universe, which was very important, and made that connection. And also from Birth of the Universe, I had Death of the Universe, and now work and the Donald Trump series. I always used a lot of political stuff because I was actually, and with Donald Trump, of course, we're so rageful in terms of the kind of thing that he's doing to America. And hopefully he will not be elected.
Adrian Piper.
Re-elected.
Adrian Piper, Eleanor Anton, Yoko Ono, Anna Mendieta. I mean, those are names that come to mind for women who were, I believe, working within, were contemporaries of Carolee Schneemann's, and also working multidisciplinary, in a multidisciplinary way, and having huge impact with their work. Please correct me if I'm wrong, and I'm sure there's people in the audience who can bring up other names. I did mention this when we were in the green room. I don't think it honors Carolee Schneemann's work or her legacy to make her impact seem bigger than it was. She does have undeniable impact, and I think it's almost coddling her in some way or dishonoring her really to say she was the first or she was the only one, because the reality is she just wasn't. So again, those are a few names that come to mind. And I wanted to say something in response to what Wendy said about how this use of the body that she was one of the pioneers of is radical and is dangerous. And I experienced that very much myself, using my body in this erotic way, using my vagina actually in a way it's very practical. It's not erotic, but actually my vagina, maybe it's not for the insertion of a sex toy or a penis during sex. Maybe it's not only for the probing, gloved hands of my gynecologist, and maybe it's not only for the birthing of a baby. I'm a woman who has chosen to not take that path of traditional motherhood. So for me, it is radical, and I think maybe it is dangerous to present this other embodiment of womanhood and to embrace my vagina and to use it in a way that's quote unquote unconventional, or that doesn't fit into any of the typical sort of condoned uses for it. So I appreciated very much what you said about that being radical and dangerous, to use the body, the woman's body, the female body in a different way.
And I think also the way Narcissister uses her body in performance is really special, because often, and I think you can see it in the art world now, a lot of younger women use their body and paint themselves naked and you can just see it all over the art world. And often when Carolee was on panels, a young artist would say, oh, I'm naked and I use my body and this is what I do. And she would snap and be like, it's been done, stop, there's more important issues right now, like this has been done. But I think how Narcissister, if you have the opportunity ever to see her perform, you'd see it's radically different and takes it to another level. So just getting to what Dan said too, and what Narcissister and Judith were saying, the vocabulary that Carolee used, the way she used paint and in all her work, whether it was objects or film or all her work, and I've learned this from working with her, because it took me time. You know, I started working with her 20 years ago, but she had 30 years of work prior. And it took time to comprehend it, and I'm still trying to understand it, because there's not a precedent for her, but a precedent for all women. So there's work that has been suppressed because it doesn't fit into the canon. So as she was not an originator, but she's using and making choices, and then people said, oh, she's messy and sloppy, and she's just showing her breasts, and she's sexy, and she doesn't know what she's doing, and she must be on drugs. It was the most horrible denigration an artist could have thrown at her, And and during Meet Joy, someone tried to strangle her in London. I mean, it was really unfortunate from the audience.
What actually is they're not treating her as an artist. They're treating this as a sex thing, and they don't see it as something that is much more complex and much more enveloping than.
Yeah, they're writing it off as
that's
just
right.
like a silly woman using her body and pulling things from her vagina and writhing with chickens and just completely dismissing her whole practice. And again, I just want to, if you ever go on YouTube and watch her speak, or have that, everyone has an opportunity to do that right after this on their phones. She's brilliant. I mean, actually, the articulation of all these things is phenomenal, and she's left a huge amount of writing and film and her own interviews and statements articulating this over and over again, so people would just simply understand that.
Well, you know what is also wonderful is that before she died, she got the Golden Lion, which was an extraordinary award in Venice, and she also had a retrospective in Austria and PS1, and it was just, she really, she got a tremendous amount, and that was so rewarding for her, and so fabulous to get that before she wasn't with us, to see that her legacy kept continuing, and she had quite a show at PS1.
Amazing.
Yes.
I also want to say in response to what you just said, Wendy, I appreciate it. I also feel that a woman artist deciding to use her work in an erotic way, to roll around with chickens, and maybe she is beautiful in conventional ways, as Carolee Schneemann was, making work that's about sex or the body. She doesn't have to be intellectual in addition to validate that work. I just want to put that out, that that's okay in itself. If a woman has the impulse to use her body in that way, to do work about that, artwork about that, to make it public, that can be enough. If, in addition, she's also interested in intellectualism, she's also interested in theory, that's wonderful, but I don't like the idea that that would be the thing that would validate the eroticism.
iBody, which you mentioned from 1963, was something that people in the art world knew about for a long time. It had been referenced, it had been in reproductions, it had been talked about. People knew that there was a paradigm, for example, for what Cindy Sherman later on did, into the late 70s, into the 80s, which is use the idea of the representation of the self as a way of sort of taking the ownership away from a male or male-dominated patriarchal system of subjecting the woman to the gaze. And I remember having a conversation with Cindy Sherman about it just around the time that we did the retrospective, and I said, you knew this work, right? And you were familiar with it. And she said, oh yeah, absolutely. We all talked about it. It was one of the paradigms we were working with. And yet, as far as I can tell from what Carolee told me, when we showed it at the New Museum, it had never been shown before. Like individual works had popped up here and there, but nobody had ever called up Carolee and said, hey, you know that series that you made in 1963 that everybody talks about all the time? Would you please show it? So between 1963 and 1996, this is where we're talking, I guess we're experiencing the pushback, the art system saying, basically to paraphrase you, Wendy, we're not accepting what you're doing. This isn't permissible. You're not going to be allowed into the canon. We simply refuse to let you do that. Do you have any
the male hierarchy had a lock on it, is what it comes down to. So that was what it came down to.
They were the gatekeepers.
They were the gatekeepers, and as a result, they let people in or they didn't let people in. And I know that with my work, although that it's feminist in context, it also, I know that a lot of feminists did not like my work because of the fact they thought that only feminist work would be self-referential. And they didn't think that observing men's behavior and taking that on would actually be a feminist stance.
Or portraying the penis.
That's correct. That's right.
Like how could that be considered political if
That's
a woman is painting a penis?
Yeah, exactly.
Wendy, how have you experienced that over the years in terms of,
It's funny. Every time when we were talking about Carolee having all the sexual stuff, there's many metaphors, because I know when I was doing these large drawings of screws that were gigantic, Jeremy Gilbert Rolfe, who used to live next door to me, he said, that's like the subtext of all the abstract expressionist paintings. So therefore, you have enormous amount of sexuality in the male work and that is not acknowledged.
It's disguised.
It's disguised, it's veiled. And therefore, it makes it more impressive, it makes it more valuable, and it makes it better to have as in a collection. Yeah.
Wendy, I was curious, you've been working now with Carolee since the end of the 90s, more or less, and how has it been for you, since we're at an art fair, how has it been for you in terms of trying to convince institutions and collectors who, they maybe, I don't know, they maybe have resisted kind of understanding what Carolee's work has been about all along?
Well, I think what we do is a form of education, and it takes many, many decades often. And as Judith said, Carolee did get honored at the Venice Biennale, and she also had a large show in Salzburg that traveled to Frankfurt and then PS1. But she was never in the Venice Biennale.
That's right.
She was
That's
never
right.
in a Whitney biennial.
It's like an honor reward for the Academy Awards,
And
Not
I
never
don't think
in a Whitney biennial.
any woman wants to be, also, it just triggering me to think about the subsets of success in the art world, how you can be a successful feminist artist, you can be a successful black artist, you can be a successful gay artist, but no one really wants to be a successful category, and that is sort of where we are. But getting back to Carolee, it is still actually a battle. A lot of museums will own one iBody piece or a film that they got from Electronic Arts Intermix, which I love them, but then they put her name on a list, and they have video monitor by the elevators, and that's Carolee's presence in a show at a major museum. We have significant major works available, and we've placed a really great piece, Noise Bodies, at the Walker recently. So we have huge victories, and there's a really wonderful traveling show in Europe by major institutions being planned right now, which will be a new monograph with new voices, a new, since she's passed away, now the next generation is a young curator, and it will bring a lot of what we talked about, and I think new thoughts about feminism, and not just feminism. I just want to get away from sticking her in that. She's really talking about redefining how we see the world through a lens that's not masculine, that's not patriarchal, and we're really far from that still. So it's important to keep going back to that, I think. But yeah, it's an uphill battle, but there are, I think society's changing. I think artists are always way ahead, and just being here on this panel and talking about Carolee, I know that history goes in waves, but I think gradually people are understanding what Carolee was just trying to tell us.
I think that there is enormous resurgence of interest in work that women have done. It is really patronizing, and it's undermines the artists when they put them in the category of only black, only feminist, et cetera, which you have mentioned. And I know that I was thrilled when I had sales to MoCA, to Museum of Modern Art, to Carnegie Museum, the Dacus collection, and to me, and a lot of museums in Europe, they're not as puritanical as they are here. They take it in the context of life. They don't take it in that category, and they're not as prurient about it. Now, my work is sexual and political, but it really is not. It is not done for prurient reasons. By the way, I see nothing wrong with doing work for a prurient reason, but nevertheless, that's not That's not where I'm at. And I find that people categorize all people who do sexual work in the same category, and they're so shocked by the image that they can't see so much of the underscore of what it actually is about, the fun gun, all the kinds of things, the psychological impact of that, by the way. What is that about, by the way? It's not just a one-liner. It has many, many subtexts. So it's actually something that has to constantly be reinforced. But people are so surprised they put all sexual work in the same category. And that is actually doesn't give people their due. Carolee's work, by the way, had enormous impact in her area, and then of course that interior scroll. She is not only about that interior scroll, but that was an enormous work that was so so extraordinary at the period at that time. Yeah, and still today. Yeah, and still influences artists today, right here.
Well, I think we can call it a turning point in art history, if we
right.
can still use the conventional term of art history. I love talking to these three panelists, but I'm aware that everyone is here not just to listen to us, but some of you actually have questions and/or contributions that you'd like to make yourselves. So I think we have a roaming microphone in the back. Is there anyone who has a question for the panelists?
We always have to beg for questions. Come on.
How about a second question, if you don't want to be the first one? Well, you know, I have a question. You mentioned sisterhood when you were talking about
Yes.
The artists working together. And I think about the art world today and sort of how things are structured in a way that's noticeably market-driven.
Right.
How would you use that term today? I mean, how is that term functional today?
Well, you know, I'll tell you something. It meant a great deal to me because when I was not selling, when I was not showing, what did I have? I still wanted a connection. So you wanted a connection, and it was very important that there was a sisterhood of women who actually were very, that wanted all the women to get more recognition. And they constantly included us when someone would come to their studio. They would recommend other people, and that was a great thing. Now, men did it all the time, but women didn't do it as much because there was so little to get, you know? There was so little out there. Well, they have one woman, and that's it, you know? And for such a long period of time, they would have exhibitions of sculptors, and it'd be all men. They would just say sculptors. They didn't say male sculptors. And the same kind, if there is a show of all women sculptors, they would say, well, that's a women's show. So it was seen in a very patronizing way. And so I think at this time, I know that it was very important for me. We had meetings all the time, and I was part of AIR Gallery, which is the first women's collective, and I had suggested at the time, I thought that a good title for the gallery would be TWAT, 20 Women Artists Together. But I was ahead of my time then too. Yes, exactly.
Is that name still available?
I've copyrighted it, but still, okay, yeah. But nevertheless, it was always important to me to have not only visual impact, but also have something to say. Now, it nails it, but it also has other things. There's a lot of other subtext. But I found that it was enormous for me to have a gallery of women artists when there was no other options. So this was not, and all the women that supported when my work was censored in Philadelphia in '74, I had a lot of enormous amount of backing from women artists of that time. So it's women artists as well as obviously other people too. But it's so important to have a body of friends, but also colleagues and people who respect your work, that they keep you going is what it comes down to.
And this is just as true today.
Yes,
as
it
would
is,
have been
and
50 years ago.
especially when young people come to New York, they have to have, they have to need a coterie of people that come to the studio, talk about it, and then recommend, et cetera. So it's very important to always have that, and it gives a lot of strength. It also validates what you're doing because you're working in many times in isolation. So it was extremely important to me, I know, when I was younger, and it still is today. Yeah. By the way, I did have support of men too. You know, it wasn't only the girls, but nevertheless, but I did get enormous strength. By the way, with the AIR Gallery, these meetings. By the way, group meetings and all kinds of things. It was very rewarding, and you had the impression, although it seemed to be very ethereal, that you were somehow part of the art world, even when it was a much smaller venue. Yeah.
Has this changed much? I mean, I'm thinking especially of artists today whose work does not fall within conventional media such that you could bring them to an art fair and hang them on a booth. What are the systems of support today? How do community-based structures of support exist? For example, Narcissister, with your work, how is community support manifested?
I guess that's tricky for me to answer because I present my work in many different arenas, not just in the art world, but also in the theater world, in the nightlife arena. I present my work in the entertainment world. For me, that was always important from the beginning, that my work be presented and be viable on a broad spectrum. I find that there can be something very insular and precious and exclusive about the art world. We all know this, and that it is driven very much by commerce. And so for me, part of, again, the radical vision for my work is that it be sort of democratic, even with all the erotics, that it be democratic in the areas in which it can be presented. So I connect with communities of artists in all those different worlds. I think something that I wanted to say that's slightly unrelated is one of the questions that I've had, or the sort of the paradoxes, is wanting to be, intending to make work that's radical, and also understanding that the more that I am embraced by institutions such as the art world, or if I do achieve these milestones that Wendy was mentioning of being collected by major institutions or having my work presented by major institutions, I wonder if that means that actually I'm slipping in my ability to make work that's truly radical, because I feel that once it can be commodified, when it's reached a point that it can be commodified, how radical really is it? That's just a question that I pose to myself again and again.
I know for me, I do what I do. If it sells, it sells. If it doesn't sell, fuck it. The point is that I do it because this is what I have to do and this is what I have to say. So I don't give a damn if it's not sold. Now, obviously, I have to make a living. And for many years, I worked as an academic, and I taught part-time, and you know those part-time jobs are just shit. But nevertheless, I taught part-times as in different places. But nevertheless, it's at this point in time, you can't live on air and water the way you could in the 70s. 70s, it cost nothing to have a loft. It's a different time frame. It's a different life. Now you have to make a great deal of money. So therefore, I'm lucky that what I did turned out to be something that is relevant today. Not only the past when I did it, but when it is relevant today. I know Chris Durkin of the Tate had said to me, your work is not just radical and in the past, it works today. When I had work at Hauser and Wirth in London anyway, the point is that you have to act. For me, It's important to do what comes from me and what is important and what I have to say. It's not just, can I get it in a gallery or not? Of course, it's always nice if a museum buys it. Don't misunderstand me. That's great.
Recognition is
Right,
good.
absolutely. I'm not against that at all. But I meant that is not the main focus point, at least for me. Yeah.
And that's why I'm willing to work in entertainment and nightlife, because that is primarily how I support my art practice.
I think Carolee, in a sense, to be honest, by not being accepted, protected her work and the honesty of her work. It gave her freedom. So let's imagine a different world. The same world, but a different world, where women were institutionalized really quickly, like men, and put up to auction. I mean, that's turning a practice, a word she didn't like, into into a investment. And so I think it did, as much as it harmed her, it's a double-edged sword, no doubt about it. And lately, I know that people who talk to me a lot have heard me say this, but people say, "How did your show do?" So that means, how did it sell?
That's right.
But my answer dawned on me recently. My answer is, it did really well. Nothing sold, because usually the
Right on, Wendy. Absolutely. Quote that again. Yes.
because that from Penny, in my experience after 37 years, many of the most famous, well-known artists we show struggled along for decades. So that's my answer to that question.
Well, it does bring up a paradox, as we were talking about before we came out. I actually struggled to think about Carolee's work in terms of critique, because it didn't seem to me that she was looking at a system and then critiquing it. It seemed that she was looking at a system and planning to replace it. She was basically
She was looking at more than the art world. I mean, she was
Well,
not so
no,
much.
of course, a much larger system, and that's what I mean. That the whole way of thinking about how canons get formed, how paradigms get started, how certain disciplines get privileged over others. I think she wanted all of that dismantled and replaced, and she was more than happy to step up to the plate and say, I'll do my part as long as I have room to keep working, as long as I can keep pushing forward.
I have a question. For young women artists, is it at least a little better coming up? Is there less resistance? That's question one. And the brotherhood of artists, is there now more socialization between men, women, and everything else out there, as opposed to this segmentation that you were referring to?
I hate to answer, because I'm so much older. When you say younger people, God, that is really not. You're not talking to me. But nevertheless, I do think that there was male and female interaction. I don't mean just sexual, obviously, but they men recommended women artists and stuff like that before. But I think that there's more so now. And of course, women. There are a lot of women getting much more recognition, and also younger artists are getting recognition now, male as well as female, and which is great, because they don't have to be a martyr, self-sacrifice, by the way, for many, 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 many years, until their voices are heard. But I think it's probably better now, would be my feeling. But I don't have a lot of firsthand knowledge of that. Yeah. There's still enclaves of women artists recommending women and men recommending men too. Yes.
I definitely think that women artists right now, and other categories, I'm going back to that, of artists, are seen as a good investment right now. So I think for the moment, but I think there's glass ceilings, and I think time will tell. But so yes, I think some barriers, like the Carolee face, like being kicked out of art school for painting a male nude, that has certainly changed. But I do think that the institution is still there's no parity. There's no parity in prices. There's no parity. You know, now people are
Absolutely.
checking boxes. Do we have this type of person for the show? And this type, because there's fear. It's from fear. You know, it's not a healthy. It's not healthy still.
What's from fear? Do you mind if I ask you to?
I think it's economic.
It's fear of being you don't have enough women in this show, so they put women in the show. You don't have enough
Right.
black artists, you don't have a gay artist, you don't. Then it's like you know, everyone reads about this, and it's like not. It's a very sick. We have a very sick culture. That's what Carol really believed,
Yes.
and we still have a very sick culture.
Yeah.
And so that's maybe driving parity, which is, you know, if something's sick, it's going to die. So we got to give it some good adrenaline, some good medicine.
It seems that there's so much out there in every magazine, in every newspaper about art, so it doesn't look like it's dying they're imminent dying.
Well, I mean the
Yeah.
success of women and the
Yes,
success
yes.
of the category of artists.
And also their trends and stuff like that, and et cetera.
I'm almost going to take, I don't know, I'd like to think that the paradigm shift that we're living through actually does consist of more, at least in some quarters of maybe not the art world explicitly, but in the culture, in the sense that people are saying, you know, let's take the hypothetical example of the group show. You know, do we have enough women in the show? Are there enough people of color? Well, I think that there's a point where you stop doing that, and then you start saying to yourself, well, the reason I didn't start from a different premise is because there's something wrong with my own thinking. I actually have to turn this machine of criticality on myself, and think again about the way I look at the world and through what lenses do I look upon the world. And then, and maybe only then, does the choice of artists who you pick to be in a group show actually start to function in a positive way and maybe not in the sick way.
Well, you know something, I think that there's also a positive element to it too, because you're showing people that other people have not seen before or have not seen as much. So therefore, people get exposed to it and they may actually like it. So therefore, and it also gives exposure to younger artists, to women artists, to, you know, all these categories. So I think that it has a positive thing as opposed to shutting them out.
But getting back to what Narcissister said, it's an institutionalized acceptance. So it's
Yes.
still in an institutionalized vision. Like the vision hasn't expanded to, and then, you know, there is the fear once it does, you're neutralized as well. So there's you know, being in the system is great, but I feel still like the artists that get into, we're talking about major group shows. It's not the downtown shows that are, like a participant, that are so amazing. It's a different type of institutionalization of a type of art, and this is what Carolee was trying to do, is make an art that did not fit in that box.
Yes.
And I think that's the crux of her legacy there, and to understand that.
I think that's a very good point. Very good point, Wendy. Yeah.
Love to get one more question out of the audience because I know it's there. You're just waiting for someone else to go first. I'm feeling like
Why don't you
maybe-
try at least one more question, Dan?
Well, I want to get back
Yeah.
to the idea of double knowledge because I feel like that's the title, and we haven't really talked about that. And I don't know. Would you be willing to say a little bit more about how you feel that functions? You know, maybe Judith or Narcissister could talk more, because I think it's something, again, that we need to explore for ourselves, not just on a theoretical level.
I'm sure we can all, and people in the audience too, can think of instances where you go into a situation, whether it's a meeting room or any interaction you have where you feel empowered to speak and then you can't speak, or you dress a certain way and then you're judged a certain way, or you think women in film, for example, don't have significant, I mean, it exists in every single aspect of life, and that's what Carol,
That's
you
right.
feel, I want this, but I can't have it merely because society doesn't want me to have it. It's not because I feel empowered that I can do this, but then you're cut down. And I think everyone, if you think about it during your day today, in some way or another, you'll see that.
I think women have to fight that all the time. There's no question about it. And yes, there's no question about it. Yeah.
Again, any more questions? Thank you.
Yes, thank you for this discussion. I've learned a great deal from you all on the panel. But speaking about feminism, can anybody reflect the era of the burning of the bras and Gloria Steinem with Betty Friedan and that whole pledge and what that might be about and how it started? If anybody has any of that knowledge, it would be greatly appreciated.
I'm not too young for it, but yeah.
That's a really big question.
Yeah, it's a very big
It's a really
question,
big
yeah.
question. It was in the, when I think about it, just an anecdotal thing, when I was a child, having Gloria Steinem, hearing about her in the news, and Judy Chicago, and that generation for me was very impactful, and I didn't even know why, because it was just, voices and images, images of these powerful women standing together. So for my own, and I know now that it changed my life. And so when it took a long time to understand it myself, but
It's great about the solidarity that actually that came about as a result. So that was very
exactly.
important.
And AIR.
And also they had the be more what you're about. You don't have to wear a bra. You don't. There was a lot of taking on the system and fucking the system and putting your finger up, by the way, for the system, and wearing a bra was part of that. And it seemed, kind of cutting away at all the female accoutrements. And now we have people like Kim Kardashian. I mean, you have to look a certain way, by the way, God forbid, but nevertheless, there's a certain look that is very, very out there at this point, as opposed to actually what is underneath there. What about your mind? What about what you have to say? Not only about your appearance. It's okay to look good too. Don't misunderstand me. But it's not. It shouldn't be the essence of what women and what people are about. Not only women, but men. But gay men, gay women, the whole potpourri of what of humankind is out there.
I mean, I'm going to take a boomer male take on that era, because what seemed to me was spelled out was that the problem with men, generally speaking, was that they weren't aware of all of the privileges that they had internalized, that the society gave them. And so one of the things that first wave feminism asked men to do is to pause and to examine certain previously unexamined behavior and mindsets. So the very thing, I mean, I can remember at a certain point where I thought I was being respectful towards women colleagues, and it was pointed at, and somebody said, well, then why do you persist in interrupting them? And it was one of those, I do that.
I have a tendency to interrupt anyway. I interrupt anyway. I don't give a damn if I'm a woman,
No, but you actually need things to be pointed out to you, to say, you are actually dipping into this well of privilege that you never earned, that you never even recognized as being privileged, and you do it day after day, hour in and hour out. And so whoever it is that has the power in that exchange is the person who's being asked, stop, pause, and look at your behavior, look at the assumptions that you're operating on. And maybe those need a closer, maybe not even maybe, those seriously need closer examination. And then, being gay, you are surprised. I've been constantly surprised at the things people will say that they feel are perfectly fine. And it happens less. But that doesn't mean that people don't just sort of exert their male privilege, their heteronormative privileges, their white privileges. That's an ongoing process. And I actually think that's when it started, when that first wave of feminist books came out. It was a moment of I'm going to take the ultimate 60s term, consciousness raising. And we're all still, I think, the beneficiaries of that, to the extent that we let ourselves be.
But you know something, the privilege, by the way, is something that's now in the general vocabulary. It's not something that is actually something that is in a niche. It is actually in the general vocabulary, which is really fabulous. And I'm glad you brought that up. That is really important. And I remember those consciousness raising groups when I was young. Not that young, but young.
One more question. Wonderful. There's a mic on it. There you go.
I think it's a privilege to have folks on the panel who have insight into Carolee Schneemann's priorities in her work and her intentions and how she wanted it to be presented and perhaps even preserved. And so my question is, what do you feel is the most ideal institutional approach to preserving her legacy?
Wendy, I think that's you.
Well, ideal, I mean,
You talk a lot of collecting a lot of her work.
I mean, I think that when the curators for her retrospective that started in Salzburg tried to travel her show, no museum in the United States took it. And it went to Salzburg, and that was the only institution that took it at all. And then Frankfurt took it, the curator there took it because they thought it was so great. And MoMA has been very supportive of Carolee, and a wonderful curator there. A group of them agreed to put it at PS1, but it was like retroactive. It wasn't like a really tight, partnered tour, as you would see probably for any number of male artists. So ideally, I think there's room for another retrospective of Carolee that would tour through American museums. There are major paintings that could be purchased from the 50s through the time of her death, close to the time of her death when she was making work, and sculptures that should be integrated into the museum collection so that when people in the future look at their work from either the 50s or 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s. It's a lot of time she worked. That her work would be, I think she would want that. And I think she'd like to see radical change in art making practice and the way people would continue her legacy, but not through like tackling big societal problems by not copying her, but by moving that forward. So that's what I think would be ideal. I think a touring retrospective through the United States would be ideal.
I'd like to add to that and say that now that more of the published work is coming out and people are becoming more aware of her contribution on that score, I think that a whole new generation of scholarship could really do wonders. I think getting new writers and new thinkers to look into her practices, and all of them, because there were many, and start to really unpack it, because the unpacking can go on for a very, very long time into the future, and I have no doubt that it will. I am sorry to have to say that we've run at the end of our time. Mm-hmm. So if you would be kind enough, I would really like to thank our panelists, Judith Bernstein, Narcissister, Wendy Olsoff. I'm Dan Cameron. Thanks all of you for coming this morning, and enjoy the rest of Art Basel.